Imagine being fully awake, fully aware, hearing every sound around you. But you cannot move, you cannot speak, you cannot even open your eyes, and everyone around you thinks you are dead. That is exactly what happened to one man in Haiti. And what came after, the grave robbers, the poison, the years of slavery, is a story so dark, so unbelievably real, that when scientists from Harvard finally investigated it, they could not deny what they found. If stories like this, strange, dark, and true, are what you live for, then you are in exactly the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is just getting started, and you do not want to miss a single part of where it goes. Now, let's go back to where it all began. It was the morning of April 30th, 1962, in a small village in central Haiti. A man named Clairvius Narcisse woke up feeling completely fine, healthy, normal, just another ordinary morning. He made his coffee. He stepped outside. The air was warm, the way it always was that time of year, and life felt steady. But by that same afternoon, everything had changed. Within hours, Clairvius was rushed to the hospital. He was coughing up blood. His fever had spiked to a terrifying level. His blood pressure was dangerously high, and fluid was filling his lungs faster than the doctors could explain. The nurses moved quickly. The doctors ran tests. But nothing made sense. A man who had been perfectly healthy just hours ago was now shutting down from the inside, and nobody could figure out why. His sister Angelina was the one who came to see him. She sat in that hospital room on a hard plastic chair, watching her brother's chest rise and fall. She held his hand. She spoke to him softly, but Clairvius never responded. His eyes stayed closed. His body lay completely still. And then something changed in his breathing. It started as a faint wheeze. Then it became something worse. A wet, broken sound, like his lungs were filling, struggling, drowning from the inside out. Angelina stood up. She squeezed his hand tighter. For just one brief moment, his eyelids fluttered. His eyes moved frantically beneath them, like he was screaming from somewhere deep inside. And then, silence. By the time Angelina returned with a doctor, Clairvius was completely still. No sound, no movement. The doctor pressed 2 fingers to his neck, waited, then slowly turned to Angelina. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Your brother is gone." Angelina cried. The family was notified, and the very next morning, under the warm Haitian sun, Clairvius Narcisse was laid into the earth and buried. Everyone grieved, everyone moved on. But here is the thing that nobody knew that day. Not Angelina, not the doctors, not a single person at that funeral. Clairvius was not dead. He heard the doctor say it. He felt the cold of the morgue. He felt the nail pierce his cheek when they sealed his coffin shut. And underneath that ground, he was waiting. He just had no idea what was coming for him next. There is something uniquely terrifying about darkness you cannot escape. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, not the darkness of a bad dream you can wake up from. The darkness of a wooden box, underground, and your lungs still breathing. That was the reality for Clairvius Narcisse in the hours after his burial. He was alive inside that coffin, completely aware, completely conscious, but his body refused to obey a single command. His mind was screaming at it. He could not lift a finger. He could not turn his head. He could not make a sound. All he could do was think, and feel, and wait. The soft crying of his sister Angelina. The murmur of prayers being spoken over his body. The dull, hollow sound of dirt hitting the top of his casket as cemetery workers filled in the grave above him. And then silence. A silence so deep and so total that it felt like the world had simply forgotten he existed. Now, most of us, when we think about fear, we think about something we can run from, something we can fight. But what Clairvius was experiencing was a fear with no exit, no action he could take, no way to signal the world above him that a terrible mistake had been made. He could only lie there in the dark and breathe and hope. And somewhere in that terrifying stillness, hours passed. Then, without warning, something changed above him. He heard it before he understood it. A scraping sound, rhythmic, deliberate, getting closer with every passing minute. Shovels. Someone was digging him up. Now, if you had been in that coffin, your first thought might have been relief. Help had come. Someone had realized the mistake. Someone was saving you. But Clairvius would later describe this moment very differently, because something in the back of his paralyzed mind told him this was not a rescue. The casket lid was pried open, cool night air rushed in, and two men stood over him, looking down at his frozen face in the pale moonlight. They did not call his name. They did not check for a pulse. They did not panic or express any kind of surprise at finding a living man inside a dead man's coffin. They simply went to work. They lifted him out. They laid him on the cold grass beside his own open grave. Then they closed the casket, lowered it back into the ground, and carefully replaced every shovelful of dirt, every patch of grass, until the grave looked completely untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. And then they came back for Clairvius. They tied his wrists. They tied his ankles. They wrapped his entire body in a heavy black cloth, lifting him like cargo, like something to be transported, not someone to be saved. And together, they hoisted him up onto their shoulders and walked off into the darkness. Clairvius could feel every step they took. He could feel the night air moving around him. He could hear the insects and the distant sound of the village fading behind him. He was being taken somewhere. And deep in the foggy prison of his own paralyzed mind, one thought kept rising above all the fear and confusion. Who sent these men? And what were they planning to do with him? There are moments in life when fear reaches a point beyond panic, beyond screaming, beyond tears, beyond anything the human mind knows how to process. It becomes something quieter, colder, a kind of horror that simply settles into your bones and stays there. That was where Clairvius was now, being carried through the Haitian wilderness in the dead of night, wrapped in black cloth, bound at the wrists and ankles, completely unable to move or make a single sound. Every step the two men took jolted his body. Every root, every uneven patch of ground beneath their feet sent a tremor through him. And yet, he could do absolutely nothing. He could not struggle. He could not cry out. He could not even turn his head to see where they were going. All he had were his thoughts, and his thoughts were relentless. He kept trying to make sense of it. Who were these men? Where were they taking him? And the question that burned the hottest, the one he could not push away no matter how hard he tried: did someone plan this? Because this was not random. These men had known exactly where to dig. They had known exactly when to come. They had moved with the kind of calm, practiced confidence that told Clairvius this was not their first time doing something like this. Someone had sent them. Someone had prepared for this moment. As the night wore on, the men did not stop to rest for long. They moved steadily, keeping off the main roads, staying close to the tree line, moving through shadows like they knew every inch of this land. And when the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, they stopped. They found a dense cluster of trees and settled in to wait out the daylight hours. Clairvius lay on the ground beside them, hidden beneath the canopy of leaves, staring up at the tiny patches of morning sky visible through the branches above him. Birds began to call out. Somewhere far away, a dog barked. The sounds of ordinary life, completely indifferent to the nightmare happening beneath those trees. He thought about Angelina. He thought about her face as she sat beside his hospital bed, squeezing his hand. He thought about how she had run for the doctor when his breathing changed, how she had tried to save him. She had no idea he was still out here. Nobody did. When darkness fell again, the men were moving once more. And this continued for days, moving by night, hiding by day, each morning bringing a new patch of ground, a new cluster of trees, a new stretch of sky for Clairvius to stare at, while his captors slept nearby. He had no food, no water, and yet somehow, impossibly, his body kept going. Whatever had been done to him, whatever that powder was that had paralyzed him, it had not killed him. It was holding him in some terrible space between living and gone. Then finally, after days of travel, the men stopped somewhere different. Clairvius could sense it even through the cloth. The air felt more open. He could hear what sounded like dozens of people moving nearby. And then he heard the metallic clang of a gate being unlocked. They carried him through. And when they finally unwrapped the cloth from around his face, what Clairvius saw made every fear he had felt up until that moment feel like just the beginning. There are places in this world that feel wrong the moment you encounter them. Not dangerous in any way you can easily explain, not loud or violent or obviously threatening, just wrong. Like something fundamental about the natural order of things has been quietly broken there, and the air itself knows it. The place Clairvius was carried into that morning was exactly like that. It was a massive field, enormous, stretching out in every direction as far as his blurry, hazy vision could reach. And moving through that field were people, maybe more. But the way they moved, that was the thing that hit Clairvius first, even before anything else registered in his mind. These people did not move the way normal human beings move. There was no ease to it, no natural rhythm. Every step looked labored and disconnected, like each limb was receiving its instructions slightly too late. Their arms swung wrong, their heads tilted at odd angles. Their eyes, when Clairvius could make them out through his own distorted vision, were vacant and glassy. Each one of them was holding a machete, and each one of them was cutting sugarcane in that same slow, broken, mechanical way, over and over and over again, like machines that had been wound up and pointed in a direction and simply never stopped. Not one of them looked up as the two men carried Clairvius through the middle of the field. Not one of them reacted to his presence. It was as if they existed in their own sealed world, completely cut off from anything happening around them. Clairvius felt a cold wave move through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. These people were like him. Whatever had been done to him, whatever terrible thing had turned his body into a prison, it had been done to all of them too. The two men carried him to a building at the center of the field. Inside, the room was dim and close, lined from floor to ceiling with shelves packed with glass jars, dried plants, small taxidermied animals, what appear in the low light to be human bones. And standing at the center of it all, behind a heavy wooden table, was an old man. He was small and thin, with deep-set eyes that moved over Clairvius's face with sharp, unsettling focus. There was no surprise in his expression, no hesitation. He looked at Clairvius the way a craftsman looks at raw material that has finally been delivered. He smiled. Then he reached behind him, lifted a small clay container from one of the shelves, and brought it to Clairvius's lips. Clairvius could not resist. He could not turn his head or clench his jaw or do anything at all to stop what was happening. The liquid poured into his mouth, bitter and thick, with an earthy, chemical taste that hit the back of his throat and spread slowly through his chest like heat. The old man began to chant, low and steady, the same phrase repeated again and again, filling the small room. And then something shifted. Clairvius felt it before he understood it. A loosening, like ropes that had been wound impossibly tight around every muscle in his body, were being released, one by one. His fingers twitched, his eyelids moved. He drew a long, shaking breath that felt like the first real breath he had taken in days. He was waking up. But what he was waking up into was something far worse than the paralysis had ever been. because the old man leaning over him was not a doctor. He was not a rescuer. He was not anyone who had come to help. He was a bokor, a voodoo priest, and Clairvius had just been handed over to him like property. The nightmare was not ending. It was only now truly beginning. There is a difference between being trapped and being broken. Being trapped means some part of you is still fighting, still pushing against the walls, still holding on to the idea that somewhere, somehow, there is a way out. Being broken means that part goes quiet. And in the days that followed inside that sugarcane field, Clairvius Narcisse came closer to broken than he had ever been in his life. The liquid the bokor had poured into his mouth that first morning had done something to him. Something he could feel, but not fully describe. It was like a fog had been lowered over his mind, not thick enough to black everything out, but dense enough to make clear thinking feel like trying to see through frosted glass. He knew who he was. He knew his name. He knew he had a family back in his village. He knew that what was happening to him was wrong. But knowing those things and being able to act on them were two completely different realities. His body moved. It responded to basic commands. He could walk, stand, lift, swing a machete. But it was like operating himself from a great distance, like the signals from his brain were traveling through water before they reached his limbs. Every morning the bokor or one of his men would move through the field and give each worker their daily dose, a small amount of liquid, administered with quiet efficiency, like farmers tending to livestock. And every time Clairvius swallowed it, that fog would thicken again for another day. The work was relentless. From the first light of dawn until the sun disappeared behind the tree line, they cut sugarcane. The same motion repeated thousands of times. Reach, cut, toss. Reach, cut, toss. The machetes rose and fell in that broken, mechanical rhythm Clairvius had first noticed when they carried him through the field. Now he was part of it. He worked alongside the others, but there was almost no real communication between them. Occasionally someone might turn their head or make a sound, but real conversation, real human connection, felt impossible in that state. They were all locked inside their own version of the same fog. But even through the haze, Clairvius's mind never fully stopped working. In the quieter moments, usually in the very early morning, before the daily dose was administered, his thoughts would sharpen just slightly. And in those small windows of clarity, one thought kept returning with more force than anything else. Someone did this to him deliberately. This had not been random. The powder rubbed onto his skin, the timing of his sudden illness, the two men who had arrived at his grave with such practiced precision. All of it had been planned. All of it had been arranged in advance by someone who knew exactly how to make a man disappear without anyone ever asking the right questions. And Clairvius knew, in that quiet corner of his mind, that the fog could never completely reach exactly who that someone was. He thought about the visit, the afternoon before he collapsed, the brother who had shown up unexpectedly, talking about letting go of old grudges, about moving past the family tension over the inheritance. The hug, the deliberate, calculated hug, where hands had pressed something into his skin that he never even felt happening. His own brother had done this to him. His own blood had sold him into this. And that realization, even muffled by fog and exhaustion and the daily chemical leash the bokor kept him on, burned in Clairvius's chest like a coal that refused to go cold. He could not escape today. He could not fight back today. But somewhere beneath the broken surface of his zombie existence, something was still alive inside him, and it was waiting. There is something about time that changes when hope becomes a distant memory. It stops feeling like something that moves forward. It stops feeling like progress or passage or the slow march toward anything at all. It just becomes weight, day after day after day, pressing down on you with the same relentless, suffocating sameness, the same field, the same machete, the same fog. The same faces moving in that broken, hollow way around you. The same bitter liquid administered each morning before the sun had fully risen. For Clairvius, weeks became months, and months, with a cruelty that felt almost deliberate, became years. 2 full years passed inside that sugarcane field. 2 years of reach, cut, toss. 2 years of fogged mornings and exhausted evenings, and nights spent in a kind of half-sleep that never felt restful. 2 years of watching the same stretch of sky move through its daily cycle above the tops of the cane stalks, the only reliable reminder that the world outside this place still existed. He thought about Angelina often, especially in those early morning windows when his mind sharpened just slightly before the dose arrived. He would picture her face, the way she had sat beside his hospital bed, the way she had squeezed his hand when his breathing changed, the way she had cried. She thought he was gone. Everyone did. And some mornings in the darkest corner of his thoughts, Clairvius wondered if they were right. Not physically. He was clearly still alive in the most basic sense of the word. But the man he had been before that afternoon hug, before the powder, before the coffin and the darkness and the field, that man felt very far away, like someone he used to know. But then came the day everything changed. It started like any other morning. The Bokor moved through the field with his men, administering the daily doses with that same quiet, mechanical routine. The workers received it. The fog settled. The machetes began to rise and fall. But on this particular morning, one of the workers did not lower his machete toward the sugarcane. He raised it toward the Bokor. What exactly snapped inside that man? What moment of clarity cut through 2 years of chemical fog, sharply enough to produce that kind of decisive action? Clairvius never fully knew. But in one sudden, shocking movement that seemed to come from nowhere, the worker struck. The Bokor went down. For a long moment, nothing happened. The field went completely still. Every machete stopped. Every fogged mind struggled to process what it had just witnessed. It was like watching people slowly wake from the same dream at the same time, each one blinking and confused, and not entirely sure what they were seeing. And then, one by one, something began to shift. The fog, without its daily reinforcement, without the Bokor standing there to maintain the chemical routine that kept them all compliant, began to thin. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like morning mist beginning to burn off under a rising sun. The edges of Clairvius's mind started to sharpen. He looked down at the machete in his hand. He looked out at the field around him. He looked at the faces of the people standing nearby, all of them blinking with that same slow dawning awareness. They were free. The gate was unguarded. The Bokor was gone. There was nothing stopping any of them from walking out of that field and never looking back. And yet Clairvius stood completely still. Because freedom, he realized in that moment, was not as simple as an open gate. Going home meant facing something that terrified him even more than the field ever had. Most people, when they imagine being freed from something terrible, picture one thing: going home. It is the instinct that lives deepest in every human being. No matter how far you have traveled, no matter what has happened to you, home pulls at something primal and powerful inside the chest. It is where the people who love you are. It is where you belong. But for Clairvius Narcisse, standing at the edge of that open field, with a machete still in his hand, and the fog finally beginning to lift from his mind, home was not a comfort. Home was a threat. Because home was where his brother was. The same brother who had wrapped arms around him in a false embrace, and pressed poison into his skin. The same brother who had paid a Bokor to make him disappear. The same brother who had stood at his graveside, watching dirt being shoveled over his coffin, knowing full well that the man inside was still breathing. That brother was alive, back in the village, living his life, probably sleeping soundly every single night, while Clairvius swung a machete in a sugarcane field and slowly lost himself to chemical fog. And if Clairvius walked back into that village, his brother would know immediately that the plan had failed, that the Bokor was gone, that the secret was no longer buried. Clairvius had no doubt about what would happen next. His brother would finish what he started, except this time there would be no paralysis, no coffin, no field. This time it would be permanent. And so, with the last of the other workers drifting away from the field in different directions, each one disappearing into the landscape like smoke, Clairvius made the most painful decision of his life. He turned away from home and walked in the opposite direction. What followed was 16 years of survival. Not living, not in any meaningful sense of the word. Survival. Bare, exhausting day-to-day survival in the northern regions of Haiti, far from his village, far from anyone who might recognize his face. He worked odd jobs wherever he could find them, farming, hauling, anything that paid enough to eat. He slept in whatever shelter was available, sometimes a proper roof, sometimes just the thick canopy of trees on a warm night. He kept to himself. He trusted no one with his real name or his real story, because the truth of where he had been and what had been done to him was so extreme that telling it to the wrong person could get him killed just as surely as walking back into his village. But even in that isolated, stripped-down existence, Clairvius never stopped paying attention. He found ways to hear news from his village, travelers passing through, market conversations, the slow, informal network of information that moves through rural communities like water through soil. And he waited. He waited for the one piece of news that would change everything. The years moved slowly. Some of them felt endless. There were nights when Clairvius sat alone in the dark and genuinely questioned whether any of it was worth continuing. Whether the life he was living, this half-existence on the margins of everything, was truly better than what he had left behind. But he kept going. And then, 16 years after walking out of that sugarcane field, the news finally came. His brother was dead. Clairvius sat with that information for a long time. He turned it over in his mind from every angle. He thought about what it meant and what it changed, and whether he truly believed it was safe now to do what every part of him had been aching to do for nearly 2 decades. He thought about Angelina's face. And then, quietly and without telling a single soul, he began walking south. Toward home. Toward the village that had buried him 18 years ago. Toward a world that had no idea he was still alive. And he had absolutely no way of knowing whether what waited for him there would be a reunion or a second ending. There is a particular kind of courage that nobody ever talks about. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that comes with adrenaline and urgency and the heat of a moment that forces your hand. Not the battlefield kind, or the crisis kind, where the decision is made before you even realize you are making it. The quiet kind. The kind that builds slowly over sleepless nights and long empty roads. The kind that carries you forward one step at a time towards something that terrifies you. Not because you have stopped being afraid, but because the alternative, turning back, finally feels worse than the fear itself. That was the courage Clairvius Narcisse carried with him as he walked back toward his village in February of 1980. 18 years. He turned that number over in his mind as he walked. 18 years since he had woken up on what felt like an ordinary morning, and made his coffee, and stepped outside into the warm air. 18 years since everything had been ripped away from him in the span of a single afternoon. 18 years of paralysis, and darkness, and fog, and fields, and exile, and silence. He was not the same man who had left. He knew that before he even arrived. He could feel it in his body, thinner now, and marked by years of hard labor. He could feel it in the deep scar that ran from the corner of his mouth to his ear, the permanent reminder of a coffin nail pressed through his cheek while the world above him thought he was already gone. He could feel it most of all in his eyes. He had caught his reflection enough times over the years to know that something behind them looked different now. Older than his age, heavier. Like a man who had seen something most human beings are never meant to see, and had carried it alone for far too long. He reached the village on a warm afternoon, and moved carefully through the familiar streets, keeping his head down, watching from beneath the brim of a worn hat. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. The distances between places that had felt enormous in his childhood memory now seemed surprisingly compact. But the market was exactly where it had always been, and standing in the middle of it, shopping with the unhurried ease of someone running a familiar errand on an ordinary day, was Angelina. Clairvius stopped. For a long moment he simply stood there and looked at his sister. She was older, of course. Nearly 2 decades had passed for her too. But she moved the same way she always had, carried herself the same way. And something about seeing her, real and present, and completely unaware of him standing just yards away, hit Clairvius with a force he had not fully prepared himself for. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times over 18 years, had rehearsed in his mind what he would say and how he would say it, had told himself he would be calm, measured, that he would find the right words and the right tone and ease her into the impossibility of what she was about to hear. But when he finally moved toward her and said her name, none of that preparation mattered, because the moment Angelina turned and looked at his face, she did not see her brother. She saw a stranger, a thin, wild-eyed old man with a horrible scar on his face, speaking her name like he had a right to it. And when Clairvius told her who he was, her expression did not soften with recognition or flood with disbelieving joy. It hardened with suspicion. She told him firmly and without hesitation that her brother was dead, that she had sat beside him in that hospital room, that she had held his hand, that she had watched him be lowered into the ground, and that whoever this man was standing in front of her, he was not Clairvius. He was nobody. When Clairvius grabbed her shoulders in desperation, needing her to hear him, needing just one person in the world to finally see him for who he truly was, Angelina screamed, and the crowd closed in around them, and a police officer pulled Clairvius away. After 18 years of surviving the unsurvivable, after everything he had endured and lost and carried alone, the one person he had walked all this way to find looked him in the eye and did not recognize him at all. There is a moment that comes after the worst has happened, not during it, not in the sharp, breathless seconds when everything is falling apart, but after, when the noise has settled and the dust has cleared, and you are sitting alone somewhere quiet, and the full weight of what just occurred finally lands on you all at once. Clairvius Narcisse sat in a small police interview room and felt exactly that. The officer across from him was not unkind, but his expression was the expression of a man doing his job carefully, a man who had heard strange things before and knew better than to take them at face value. He had a notepad, a pen, and the particular kind of patient, measured stillness that police officers develop after years of listening to stories that do not quite add up. Clairvius looked at his hands on the table in front of him and took a slow breath. And then he told the truth. All of it. He started at the beginning, the morning he woke up feeling fine, the unexpected visit from his brother, the hug, the powder he never felt being pressed into his skin, the fever that came on like a wave and pulled him under before he even understood what was happening. He told the officer about lying in that hospital bed, fully conscious, hearing everything, hearing the doctors discuss his condition in the corridor, hearing Angelina's voice break when she cried, hearing the word dead spoken over him like a verdict he had no power to appeal. He told him about the cold of the morgue, about the sound of the nails being driven into his coffin, about the specific searing pain when one of those nails pushed through the wood and through his cheek, carving the scar that still sat on his face to this day. He told him about the two men and the shovels and the nights of travel through the wilderness, about the bokor and the building and the liquid poured into his mouth, about the sugarcane field and the people moving in that broken, mechanical way, about 2 years of fog and labor and the slow erosion of everything he had once been. He told him about the day the bokor was killed, and the gate was opened, and the choice he made to walk away from home because home still held the man who had done this to him. He told him about 16 years of wandering northern Haiti, working, surviving, listening for news, waiting for the one piece of information that would finally make it safe to come back. The officer sat quietly through all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not laugh or dismiss or reach for a phone to call someone about the clearly confused old man in his interview room. He just listened, and when Clairvius finished, the officer put down his pen and looked at him for a long moment. Then he went to find Angelina and the other siblings. He explained that he needed them to help him with something specific. He needed them to write down questions, not general questions, not things a stranger might guess or research, deeply specific things, childhood memories, private family details, moments and conversations, and small particular facts that only someone who had truly lived inside that family could possibly know. The siblings were skeptical. Understandably. What they were being asked to consider was not just unlikely, it was impossible. Their brother had been dead for 18 years. They had buried him. They had grieved him. They had built their lives around his absence. But they wrote the questions, and the officer brought them back to the interview room. And one by one, he read each question to the man sitting across from him. And one by one, without hesitation, without pausing to calculate or guess, or construct an answer, Clairvius answered every single one of them correctly. The room went very quiet after the last answer. The officer looked down at his notepad, then back up at the man across from him, then down again at the answers that matched perfectly, detail for detail, with what the siblings had written. There was no rational explanation for how a stranger could know these things. There was only one explanation that actually fit. This man was exactly who he said he was. Clairvius Narcisse, buried 18 years ago, declared dead by doctors, mourned by his family, gone from the world in every way the world knew how to measure. And sitting right here, alive, scarred, exhausted, but real. The news moved fast after that. First through the village, then beyond it, then across Haiti entirely, and then carried on the strange, unstoppable current of a story too extraordinary to stay contained. It spread across the globe. A man had come back from the dead, and the world had a choice to make about what to do with that. Most people, particularly those far from Haiti, made the easy choice. They called it folklore, a hoax, a dramatic local legend dressed up as news. They smiled politely and turned the page and went back to the comfortable certainty that the dead stay dead and the world works the way they have always understood it to work. But not everyone made that choice. Because 2 years after Clairvius walked back into his village, a researcher from Harvard University boarded a plane to Haiti. He was not coming to dismiss the story. He was coming to find out if it was true. And what he discovered when he got there would not just confirm what had happened to Clairvius Narcisse. It would change the way science understood the boundary between life and death itself. Some stories end with answers, and some answers, when they finally arrive, are more unsettling than the mystery ever was. This is one of those. In 1982, a Harvard University ethnobotanist named Wade Davis arrived in Haiti with a scientist's skepticism and a researcher's discipline. He was not there to validate a legend. He was not there to romanticize voodoo culture or sensationalize a story that had already captured the world's attention for the wrong reasons. He was there to find the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was sitting quietly in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right knowledge to finally look at it directly. Wade Davis spent months in Haiti. He interviewed Clairvius extensively. He spoke with medical professionals, community members, and people deeply embedded in the cultural and spiritual practices of the region. He collected samples, he ran tests, he approached the entire investigation with the same rigorous methodology he would have applied to any serious scientific inquiry. And what he found was this: the powder that Clairvius's brother had pressed into his skin during that calculated, devastating hug was real. It was a carefully prepared compound that had been used in Haitian folk practice for generations, and its active ingredient was something that required no mysticism to explain: tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin found naturally in pufferfish, one of the most potent poisons known to exist in the natural world. When absorbed through the skin in precise amounts, tetrodotoxin causes complete paralysis of the voluntary muscles, while leaving the mind entirely intact. It slows the heart rate to a level so faint it becomes undetectable without sophisticated medical equipment. To a doctor in a rural Haitian hospital in 1962, using the diagnostic tools available at the time, a patient under the influence of tetrodotoxin would present as exactly one thing: dead. Davis's findings confirmed what Clairvius had described with stunning accuracy: the paralysis, the complete physical stillness while remaining mentally conscious, the inability to react or communicate while hearing and feeling everything happening around him. All of it was entirely consistent with tetrodotoxin poisoning at a carefully calibrated dose. And then there was the second substance, the liquid the Bokor poured into his mouth upon arrival at the plantation, and then continued administering on a near daily basis. Davis identified this as Datura stramonium, known locally as the zombie's cucumber, a potent hallucinogenic plant native to the region that, when ingested regularly, produces exactly the symptoms Clairvius had described throughout his time in the field: the fog, the slowed thinking, the disconnection between intention and action, the docile, compliant state that made resistance feel impossible, even when the mind knew something was deeply wrong. Together, these two substances created something that science had never formally documented, but that Haitian communities had understood and feared for a very long time: a method for making the living disappear, not through death, through chemistry. Davis published his findings, and they sent a quiet but significant tremor through the scientific community. Not because anyone suddenly believed in supernatural zombies, but because the implications of what he had documented were profound in ways that extended far beyond one man's story. If tetrodotoxin could mimic death so completely that it passed medical examination, what did that mean for how we define death itself? What did that mean for the cases throughout history where someone declared dead had later shown signs of life? How many times, in how many places, across how many centuries had something like this happened, without anyone having the framework to understand it? These were not comfortable questions, but they were necessary ones. As for Clairvius Narcisse himself, he lived the rest of his life in his village, with his siblings, in the quiet, ordinary rhythm of a man who had survived something almost no one would ever believe, and carried it with a dignity that most people could not imagine. He lived with Angelina, the sister who had held his hand in that hospital room, the sister who had watched him be lowered into the ground, the sister who had looked him in the eye 18 years later in a market and seen a stranger, and who had then, when the truth finally settled into place like the last piece of something long broken, held him again. He never sought revenge. There was no one left to seek it from. His brother was gone. The Bokor was gone. The sugarcane field had closed around its secrets, like water closing over a stone. All that remained was the living. Clairvius Narcisse died in 1994 at the age of 72. A real death this time, peaceful, surrounded by family. He had been buried once before and come back. This time, he was ready to rest. And the story he left behind, the story of a man who was poisoned by his own brother, declared dead by doctors, buried alive, dug up in the night, turned into a slave, and then wandered the wilderness for 16 years before walking back into the world. That story did not fade with him. It spread. It was studied. It was documented. It became one of the most extraordinary and thoroughly investigated cases in the history of ethnobotany and forensic medicine, because the truth, no matter how impossible it sounds, has a way of refusing to stay buried. Just like Clairvius. Just like Clairvius.